Welcome to the AI and Faith podcast. We are a community of expert technologists, professionals, and faith leaders bringing the ancient wisdom of the world's major religions to the ethics of artificial intelligence. Join us on this new journey and welcome to the conversation.
We encountered some pushback around the idea of digitizing Jewish texts just because it was a relatively new idea at the time. And there was a sense that what it means to be attached to books is to be attached to the cardboard and paper versions of books. So I think that is something that's it's in Jewish culture, and it was something that unfolded in the Jewish community, but I think it's actually a widespread question. Does it count as a textbook if it's not even a book in, recognizable form?
My name is Joshua Mendel, and I will be your podcast host. Today's episode is an interview with researcher Rabbanit Sarah Wolkenfeld from December 23rd, 2024. In this episode, we discuss AI's role in Jewish learning and continue the millennia-old debates about the progress of technology in Judaism. I learned a lot from this conversation, and I hope you do too. Today, I am excited to be talking to Sara Wolkenfeld, who is the Chief Learning Officer at Sefaria, about artificial intelligence and Jewish learning. My name is Joshua Mendel. I'm studying to become a rabbi at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, and I have worked on a few other interviews for AI and Faith with my partner, Dr. Malin Boguslav, who writes for that organization. Sara, can you please introduce yourself and what you do, and tell me a bit about how your work is influenced by both artificial intelligence and religion?
My name is Sara Wolkenfeld. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at Sefaria. Sefaria, for those who might not be familiar, is a database and new interface for Jewish texts. Our mission is to bring the ancient Jewish canon into the digital age. And maybe from that introduction, it's obvious how my work is influenced by both artificial intelligence and religion. We are an organization dedicated to bringing Jewish texts to the Jewish people. And my own background is very much in scholarship of these ancient Jewish texts. And so that is a primary driver of my work and really the mission of my work. And also, we've decided to use cutting-edge digital technologies in order to make these texts accessible to as many people as possible. And machine learning, artificial intelligence, all of these are tools that help us to make these texts more accessible.
Cool. Can you tell me a little bit more about what Sefaria looks like for listeners that may not be familiar with it, what it looks like, how it's used, what the goal of it is?
Sefaria is a digital library, and if you were to open it up on a screen, hopefully it would resonate as a library. We have a table of contents with lists of texts, and you can click to open any one of the many books that we've digitized and uploaded to the site. What makes Sefaria different from perhaps a different kind of online library and uniquely well suited to the study of traditional Jewish texts is that if you were to open any book, let's say the book of Genesis, you could click on any verse in that book, or actually any passage in any book, and a side panel will open that will show the reader all of the connected texts. Any text that quotes or alludes to that verse in Genesis that is known to Sefaria will appear in that side panel. This is important because Jewish texts are not designed to be read kind of one at a time, or that's not meant to be the optimal user experience for users who learn Jewish texts. They're meant to be read side by side with one another. They're always interacting, commenting, agreeing, disagreeing, alluding to, and Sefaria's interface is built to showcase those connections.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things about using Sefaria. That hyperlinking and connection between different texts makes it so easy to learn new things and find connections in my Jewish studies. From using Sefaria, I've noticed it's a very technologically advanced and modern online resource. How are you using artificial intelligence in it? I haven't seen any user-facing stuff like a chatbot yet. Is that something we could expect to see in the future?
I can't really comment on future plans, mostly because technologies are evolving so rapidly, but I can say a few things. First of all, I would kind of break down the barrier that people kind of have in just everyday discourse between machine learning tools and artificial intelligence, there is somewhat of a continuum. So those links that you can see on Sefaria that I mentioned, those are generated through machine learning tools. And as machine learning improves, and now we use artificial intelligence more and more, both to generate those links, to check the accuracy of those links, to get more and more links. So that's actually an example of where artificial intelligence is already active on our site, but people don't, it doesn't jump out at you. People don't necessarily notice that on a regular basis, but it's very important to the success of our website. We have done experiments. We've had a partnership with an organization called Applied AI and the Technical University of Munich to do some experimenting with RAG technology, retrieval augmented generation, and see what happens as you experiment with AI on the data in our site. But I would also say that a big piece of Sefaria's mission is really empowering other organizations and other app developers, other engineers to use our data and build on it. And so I think that very much what happens with the future of artificial intelligence and Jewish text will likely depend on where other people want to take it. I regularly get emails from people telling me that they've worked to train ChatGPT on Sefaria's data or parts of Sefaria's data. And I expect those are conversations that we'll continue to have.
That's cool. Can you tell me more about partnering with other organizations on Sefaria's technology?
It's not really so much that we partner with them. It's more that Sefaria is an open source site. And maybe I should have led with that. Our data, our code is open source. We're a nonprofit, and our mission really is, as I said, to bring Torah into the digital age and to open up access to these texts. So texts are books, but texts are also digital files. And we want people to have access to that data as much as possible. And so Sefaria has a developer portal. Anyone who knows how to use a developer portal can go on there and can experiment with using our data for whatever website or tool they are building or creating.
Got it. Very cool. So in the context of training things like ChatGPT with Sefaria's database and having it accessible through interfaces like that, is there anything that worries you about using AI or chatbots or anything like this in the context of Jewish texts and Jewish learning?
I think everyone who does this work will need to proceed with caution. And, I think that the questions of what we as a society want to do with these tools, those are still unfolding. Again, my work is focused on the texts themselves. And so I'm very much thinking about how we can increase links between texts, which is a major key for giving access, for helping people to have a richer experience of the text. I'm thinking about how AI can help us with things like punctuating texts and vocalizing texts, also very important for access to those Hebrew texts for those who read Hebrew but need them a little bit more processed in order to be able to understand them. And so that's really where my work is centered. And then in addition, I spend a lot of time thinking about ethics of technology as reflected in Jewish sources.
Is there a Jewish text or source that talks about ethical use of technology like this that you'd like to talk about?
There are many sources that talk about ethical uses of technology, but I think, though they wouldn't frame it that way, one text or one series of texts that I think a lot about are the texts of the Talmud that talk about the transition from oral text to written text, because the Talmud itself, which now is, if it's not on Sefaria, is a set of printed books that takes up a considerable amount of real estate on a bookshelf, but it was not originally, of course, it was not in print originally, since it predates the printing press significantly, and it wasn't even a written text originally. The Talmud is self-conscious about itself as an oral text. It calls itself oral Torah, and so it was something that was meant to be passed down from teacher to student, and then to that students, and so on and so forth. And it was memorized in large chunks. And the Talmud actually believes that it is forbidden to write down those words, that it's meant to be passed down orally. When it becomes clear that actually people are writing things down, people want to write things down, there's a value in writing things down. There are a number of places where the Talmud kind of weighs this, and you have the opportunity to really think and to watch as the rabbis of the Talmud think through, well, what makes a new medium good or bad? What makes us choose to use it or choose to reject it? I think it's not so much the conclusions there as the modeling of that conversation that's really useful for religious people today to think about as we contemplate making decisions about, first of all, the media in which we want our texts to be transmitted, and also just more broadly thinking about how we respond to new technologies.
Yeah. Have you encountered any religious pushback on use of artificial intelligence in Jewish texts or anything like that?
I'm not sure it's really artificial intelligence per se. Again,
Okay.
that's, I think, still an emerging field, but definitely we encountered some pushback around the idea of digitizing Jewish texts just because it was a relatively new idea at the time.
Mhm.
And there was a sense that what it means to be attached to books is to be attached to the cardboard and paper versions of books. So I think that is something that's actually, it's in Jewish culture and it was something that unfolded in the Jewish community, but I think it's actually a widespread question. Does it count as a textbook if it's not even a book in, recognizable form? And does it matter if our children read books on paper, or can they read books on a screen, or can they listen to audiobooks? I think that question of whether it matters and how it matters is something that is just shared across society at this point, and there's
Mhm.
a lot of discomfort around those shifting media. So I don't think it was specific to Sefaria, but also through Sefaria, I encountered those questions and feelings.
I've noticed, like in my own studies, I feel, I would say, more religiously connected to the texts when I actually open up a physical book and can flip through the pages. But I use Sefaria a lot more because it's so convenient, and the hyperlinking and cross-referencing of different texts makes me find new connections and things that I wouldn't find just by opening up a book. So I feel like it's a delicate balance between the two. When you study personally, do you use a combination of digital and physical books? How do you decide when to use one versus the other?
I do use a combination, and a big part of how I make that decision is just convenience. I
Mhm.
travel a fair amount, and it's more convenient. It's easier for me to access text digitally when I'm traveling. I'm limited by what I have in my house, what is on the same floor as in the house as where I am at any given time, right? How lazy I'm being. So that's definitely
Yeah.
a consideration. Also, in my own religious practice, I don't use digital tools on Shabbat from sundown on Friday evening till dark on Saturday night. I don't
Mhm.
use computers or phones or any digital media. And so then I'm all about books. I'm happy that I'm able to go back and forth between those two. That feels comfortable. I think it'll be different for the next generation and the next generation who might not feel as comfortable going
Mhm.
back and forth. So that's part of the answer. And then I think similar to what you said about maintaining a balance, search is a lot easier digitally. So
Yeah.
it's not uncommon for me to search for something on Sefaria. And then if I know I have the book and it's just as easy for me, I might grab the book and open to that page in the book. But Sefaria is a huge help to me in finding the reference to begin with. So I think it's good to balance. And I think that the Talmud, those passages that I referred to, encourage us to be thoughtful in terms of what medium am I using and why did I choose this one for this moment.
Do you think that there are things that we could be conscious of when teaching the next generation, who's obviously going to grow up even more immersed in this technology than previous generations? Are there things we can do to make sure that they still have the skills to use physical books and the appreciation for that, when tools like Safari are only going to become more and more prevalent and easy for them to access?
I'm sure that there are. I think you
Mm.
can teach anything you decide to teach. I think the question is, will we teach that out of a sense of nostalgia, or will we
Mm.
teach it out of a sense that there's something actually valuable here? And I think some people will teach it actually out of a sense of nostalgia and tradition, and that could work for some people in
Yeah.
some contexts, and for other people in other contexts that won't work as well. And then we'll have to think about, well, are there other reasons to use books? Again, in a particular community of practice, one reason will be because we don't use screens on
Mhm.
Sabbath, and so we also need this backup plan of books. But that's not going to work for every community, for every context, and so everyone's going to have to think about their own reasons. And if the reason is nostalgia or tradition, you're going to have to work up a pretty compelling argument to convince, as you said, the next generation and the next generation who are even more steeped in these technologies that nostalgia is a good enough reason to use a
Mm.
technology that feels outdated. I think that is sometimes possible, but it's difficult.
Do you think there's things that we do in Judaism just out of nostalgia? I'm thinking like a Torah is a scroll, and we have what would on the outside be considered more modern technology than that, yet we still use a scroll in parchment bound in wood for some of our holiest texts. Do you think that's just nostalgia, or is there a more compelling reason that we could use as a model for these future shifts in technology there?
I think it's a great example. And I think the best way that I've found so far to have that conversation is to ask people who are used to using a Torah scroll for certain ritual moments, which is most Jews who go to synagogue at all, that is the technology that they use to read from the Torah in the synagogue. It's not 100%. In my non-scientific surveys, I'd say it's about 99 point something percent of Jews. If I ask, like, do you occasionally attend synagogue? Yes. Is a Torah scroll the technology you use to read from the Torah in synagogue? Again, most of the time, the vast majority of the time, the answer is yes. And so then what's fun to do is to kind of ask, well, what would you think if next week you showed up to services and actually you were the person chanting from the scroll was not chanting from a scroll, but chanting from an iPad or chanting from a printed book. That kind of imagined scenario helps people unpack, is the scroll important to them? And if so, why is it important? There are Jewish legal restrictions around using the scroll. That's true. And that's compelling to a particular audience. But I have found that there is a significantly sized audience of people who don't necessarily or wouldn't necessarily say about themselves that they care about being bound by Jewish law, and nonetheless feel really strongly about the scroll technology for the reading of the Torah in synagogue on ritual occasions. And there's also a great conversation in the Talmud about this, where they kind of unpack a little bit, like, well, maybe it's more respectful to the congregation, maybe it's a sign of sort of importance, prominence, it gives a certain gravitas to the moment, perhaps, and maybe that's a reason to continue using scrolls.
I really like that idea of asking people how they would feel if the technology were to shift. It's a good way of getting people to reflect on their connection to it. I'm curious about the use of machine learning you mentioned punctuating and potentially translating some Jewish texts. I've found a lot of commentaries on Sefaria still only exist in unpunctuated, unvoweled Hebrew with no translations. Is that something you would use machine learning to augment? And do you think there's a difference between a human translation of a holy text and a machine translation?
So translations, I didn't mention yet because it's something that I'm thinking about and like the rest of the world, seeing how that will play out. I think for vocalization and for punctuation, it's very important. And I think one reason perhaps that even people who feel that translating texts using AI is problematic, I think that vocalization and punctuation feels not so scary because there is maybe it seems less like creative labor. There is probably more clearly a right answer. And it seems more like using a computer as a calculator, I think, for most people. So that's something that I think will continue and I think will only get better over time. And I think the religious questions around translation and even writing text are really interesting. And I'll just say like a kind of a fertile ground, I think, for interfaith dialogue in terms of what do you think is the role of the translator? What do you think is the role of the teacher? And how much does the medium or the context matter? If you don't understand Hebrew texts, then no matter how many of those we put up on Sefaria, it's not going to be helpful to people. And so there's a kind of cost-benefit question of, how do we make these texts accessible and what's the best way? And I would just say that one of the, for context, and I don't know the parallel to this in other religions, but Sefaria has multiple Bible translations. And it is not infrequent that we get emails telling us that one translation or another is bad or wrong. That's been really interesting because these translations are published translations, 100% done by humans. And then we kind of have to have the conversation of, what do you think is bad about it? What do you think is wrong about it? Could this word have other meanings besides the one that you're familiar with? And so I really see all of these technologies and the whole process of making text more accessible as a way of opening up these conversations.
One of the things that I really appreciate about my Jewish education is that we used translation a lot of the time, but we were always cautioned that it's an interpretation and a representation of the original text, and you can never completely rely on a translation. I'm very curious to see how AI and machine learning is going to help us move forward in that conversation in the future.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is interesting about Jewish texts in particular is that the original we don't have a sense, right? Exactly. So we don't have a sense that there is a canonical English version.
Right.
There's a canonical Hebrew version. If you don't speak Hebrew, then that doesn't resonate with you. And so I think that the whole question of translation maybe takes on a different tenor when you're saying that there's a language that's sacred and you either have access to that language or you don't. I think it maybe changes the parameters of the whole conversation.
I always try to remember that a translation is just an interpretation, but it can also tell you something about the author. And I would be curious to read a well-done machine translation of a Jewish text and see if it has the same kind of impact as learning about the author of a translation, of a human translation does. Is there anything else that you want to tell us about or that you're particularly interested in regarding AI use in Sefaria?
I'll just say again that really I'm very interested in opening up these ethical conversations about technology and religion more broadly. And I think that everybody now, the whole world is sort of playing catch up in trying to generate an ethical language around these new technologies or figuring out which ethical concepts we already have that apply. And I'm really interested in doing that within the realm of Judaism.
Have you had conversations with people from other religions about their thoughts on that?
For now, I'll just say that I think that Christianity, Catholicism in particular, is sort of a little bit ahead in thinking this through, and that the Vatican's already issued a statement about AI. So I think that that's important for Jewish scholars to be thinking about.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this. I found it fascinating, and I appreciate your time.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Stay tuned to listen to more recordings and interviews with experts from around the world. In the meantime, follow and rate our podcast on your favorite podcast platform and share with your friends. Don't forget to follow us on our social media as well. We're on LinkedIn and X. Thank you for joining us today.